right. Well, good morning. My name is Helen Christians, and I'll be your MC this morning. I want to welcome you all to the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting. Humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching primary importance to human experiences and activities and the wonders of the natural world rather than the supernatural. Humanists value the worth and goodness of all human beings and seek to find common values and respect among people. Humanists stay curious and open as they seek rational ways to solve problems by listening to others and speaking their own truth to find equitable solutions through science, reason, and free inquiry. Our topic at today's meeting, the LGBT plus acronym, what do all those letters mean, especially addresses the humanist commitment of empathy, ethical development, and social justice. This morning, Al Christians will be our reader. And Al, come on in here. I'll move aside.
Our reading today is from Volume 4 of Our Times, a 6-volume history of America. It's a wide-ranging history, covers cultural and social changes, technology, politics, and the regular mainstream stuff in history as well. It's a history of America from 1900 to 1925 by Mark Sullivan. This was published in 1931. Sullivan was a newspaper writer known as the Jeremiah of the United States press. And this reading is just about change and how it happens and all the things that it brings in with it. And he says, hardly any intellectual revolution in history was more complete than the transition from reverence for Emersonian Puritanism up to about 1910 to fierce jibing at it subsequently. It was a denial by American authors of the most American standard, almost the only American standard we had, a rejection of the austere morality of a New England philosopher to make way for the biological theory of an Austrian physician to diseased minds. The new novels and plays written from about 1914 until the middle of the 1920s took the Freudian thesis in one degree or another, and by that name or under the designation realism as the basis of the love episodes they contained. Through all this, romantic love, not only in literature but in life, had a rough time. A generation of youth made familiar by novels and the stage with the exclusively biological explanation of love came to be a little ashamed of romantic love or became heretics denying its existence. Interest in Freud and his theory removed the taboo upon sex as a topic susceptible to discussion in what used to be called mixed company. Once sex as a subject of conversation permissible, it became naturally general, to the considerable embarrassment of persons aged 30 or more, who could recall when the word leg was questionable, and the word sex, for example, not questionable at all, but strictly forbidden. By 1915, William Marion Reedy, a St. Louis newspaper editor, was moved to remark, "It's 6 o'clock." This phenomenon, until we got used to it, was acutely disturbing. Now, at this point, there's a little mention by Sullivan, also a newspaper writer, that there was some backlash against Freud in the 1920s, before his book was written, and that there was some criticism of him. But then he comes back to kind of sum up. This next sentence is interesting. Some of the new frankness and new understanding had partial value. that word partial in there, I thought of leaving out because I sometimes leave out leave out superfluous words in the interest of time when I do these readings. But partial, I would change the meaning if I left that out. I'm not sure why he put that in there, given that what his next sentence is, which is a nice conclusion for this reading, which kind of seems to say it wasn't very partial. There was much validity in the supporter of Freud who said of the older order that, quote, sending the young out into life with such a false psychological orientation was as if one were to equip people for going on a polar exploration with summer clothing and maps of the Italian lakes.
Where did you find that? That was good. That was a good reading, honey. Thank you so much. I'd like to now welcome our today's speaker, Reid Vanderburgh. I am able to say his name correctly because it rhymes with Pittsburgh. Reid Vanderburgh is a retired therapist who worked primarily with transgender clients and their family members. Reid is the author of 2 books, Transition and Beyond, The Observation of Gender Identity, and his second book, Journeys of Transformation, Stories from Across the Acronym. Numerous book chapters and 2 journal articles. So we're so lucky to have you, Reid. Reid is a board member of the William Temple House, a local social service organization, and the Portland chapter of PFLAG, Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. In his spare time, Reid sings baritone in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus. And please consider visiting his website, which would be www.reidvanderburgh.com. And I'll put that website in the chat for those of you to make sure you get it spelled right. All right. Well, welcome, Mr. Vanderburgh. And we're so looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is this big, long acronym. There's a reason for that plus sign. LGBT plus, because the full acronym is LGBTQQIAAPNb, and that's just a bit daunting. But that's why I'm here today, is to explain what all those different letters mean. Now, a little bit about me. I own several identities in this acronym. I'm a trans man, and this is why so many people sought me out for help answering the question, how do I want to live my life in the context of gender identity? I began my transformative process some 25 years ago. So this is what 25 years in transition looks like everybody else. I identify as queer. And the reason I do is because I'm an honorary lesbian. An old friend of mine from my lesbian community days dubbed me an honorary lesbian several years ago. And I was really honored by that, because that is not a community of people that typically has intrinsic respect for a lot of men. I dwelt 22 years in the Portland lesbian community. I'm a stepdad. I have a 30-year-old stepdaughter. She came to live with her mother and I when she was 15, and I felt really honored that she chose to join the GSA in her high school, the Gay Straight Alliance, because of me, because she had a trans stepdad. I'm a former therapist, as you know. I already talked about that, so I won't say more about that because I have a limited amount of time to talk about all those letters of the acronym. And I sing in the Gay Men's Chorus and have done since 2008. As a little side note, I was a founding member of the Portland Lesbian Choir in 1986. So I go way back in the LGBT choruses in this region. And I'm married to a woman, quite happily married to someone who also sings in the Portland Gay Men's Chorus. She joined this term singing first tenor. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the 2 fundamental identities that are represented by most of those letters of the acronym. Sexual orientation. Who do you fall in love with and form relationships with? What kinds of people are you attracted to? So this is you in relationship to other people. But gender, when you're alone in the bathroom in the morning looking in the mirror, there's a reflection back at you that other people will call a man or a woman. Are you okay with that? This is your relationship to yourself. It says nothing about who might be on the other side of that bathroom door waiting to have breakfast with you. This is just about you. And it's a very deeply personal identity as a result. So until you're in right relationship with that reflection at the level of gender, you can't really be in right relationship with someone else. Now, there's one word I'd like to highlight. There's a lot of words I could talk about, but I could go on for hours about terminology. Cisgender is a relatively new term in the lexicon of gender identity, and it's an important word because it levels the playing field. Before this word came into existence, we had transgender and we had normal. There was no word for people who were content with their birth gender assignment. But if this is what normal means, and I'm speaking here as a writer with the power of language, if this is normal, what's this? Abnormal or not normal in some way. So adding cisgender to the lexicon, giving terminology for these folks, levels the playing field. And it's been adopted very widely as a result. Now, I want to talk a bit about where all this began, this big, long acronym. And when I say where it began, there's a caveat here. This is where it began in the US. The term LGBT plus community is a US generated term. So if you go to other countries, other cultures, you'll find different interpretations of identity, different levels of acceptance, just a whole different way of viewing all of it. So when I say where it began, I'm talking about here. These photographs, the ones on the right of the riot looking photographs, those were taken on June 28th, 1969. The police raided one too many gay bars. Now you might ask, why would the police raid a bar where people are just sitting there drinking beer? Well, the reason, I can give an example from my personal experience. I came out as a lesbian in 1974. I grew up in San Francisco, so those are the bars I was going to. And there was this one bar that I went to pretty regularly, and like the front door was here, and then there was tables and a dance floor and the bar, and then back down a hallway, there were the bathrooms. And there was this alcove back there. It was about 12 feet square, and it had benches around the side of it. And typically when I was go to the bars, people would go back there to hold a quiet conversation because, you know, there's disco music going on out here. So if you want to have a little chat with somebody, you'd go back to this alcove and sit on those benches. But back in the day, before the Stonewall riots, this was the 1970s, things were more acceptable. In the 1950s and 60s, the police would raid the bar coming in the front door. This was all tables. There was no dance floor at that time. There was the bar. The bartender would hit a button on the underside of the bar, and a light would go on in that alcove because that was the dance floor. And if that light went on, everyone dancing immediately sat on those benches because it wasn't legal for two women to dance together. It wasn't legal for two men to dance together. That's why these riots happened. It was a protest against that level of subjugation. Now, you'll see in the photograph on the upper left of this slide, there's a woman being hauled away by the police, and she's got her hand extended and her mouth is open. Her name is Stormé de la Verrier, and she was a regular at this bar, the Stonewall Inn, and she was the kind of person that if another regular didn't show up for a few days, she would check on them and make sure they were okay. She's the kind of person that if you were sick, she'd make you chicken soup. So she was really popular. Everybody knew who she was. What she's doing, she's gesturing back to her friends who were standing outside the bar, and she's yelling at them, "Why don't you guys do something?" And they did. They started throwing rocks and bottles at the cops for the first time, and it started a 4-day riot. And the other thing it started was the modern gay and lesbian civil rights movement. Now, initially, it was white gay men who were doing the organizing, which is an interesting factoid because the Stonewall Inn was primarily patronized by drag queens and trans women of color. So if you think about that, though, 1969, even today, a Black trans woman, if Black trans women banded together, how much traction are they going to get forming civil rights and social justice movements? Not a lot. But white gay men, yes. So it was white gay men who started what they were calling gay community. Well, lesbians said, we can see where this is going. Saying that gay includes us is exactly the same thing as saying mankind includes women. It never did, it never has, it never will. So we need new terminology. And so it was lesbian and gay community for a very long time. That's what I came out into in 1974 in San Francisco, was lesbian and gay community, 5 years later. Now, bisexuals tried really hard to participate. Now we're up to the B in the acronym, LGB. They tried very hard to participate and didn't get any respect at all. They weren't taken seriously. At that time, no one really believed that bisexual was an actual identity unto itself. Now, as part of lesbian community, I can speak to what the attitude was among lesbians about bisexual women. The attitude was, don't trust them, because as soon as a man comes along who could support them, they will desert you, they will leave you, you will have your heart broken. It's not going to work. The other attitude was they must be promiscuous because they're attracted to both men and women. If they're attracted to everybody, then why would they ever be monogamous? Among gay men, and I know this now from having sung in the gay men's chorus for almost 15 years, I've learned a lot about gay men's attitudes. Their attitude was, bisexual isn't a real identity. These are just guys who are afraid to take that last step and say, yes, I'm gay. So they saw being bi as a stepping stone toward being gay. But in neither case were bisexuals respected. Now, the trans identity, this is where we get into the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. For gay men and lesbians and bisexuals, living in authenticity means coming out. Didn't necessarily mean coming out at work at that time because you could lose your job, but that doesn't make you feel bad about yourself. That just makes you mad at the system. But if you are not out to your family, if you are not out to your friends, that eats away at you because that's the closet, and that is not living in authenticity. Trans, on the other hand, when someone transitions, it's the transition process that's visible. If you look at the pictures on this slide and you look at me, if I hadn't told you I was trans, you would not know that. And you wouldn't recognize these folks if you saw them on the street. Every person in this photograph is transgender, all of them, but you wouldn't know that. But does it feel like the closet if they don't come out? Well, no, it doesn't. And the difference is this: every time somebody uses the right name and pronoun for them, it affirms their identity. They just choose not to tell people how they got there. And so trans was an invisible identity for a long time because there wasn't a lot of incentive to come out. Now, it started emerging as more of a community in the mid-1990s, and that was because of the advent of the internet. Because even though we didn't really feel like, well, we have to come out to feel authentic, there's a lot of power in sitting across the table from someone over coffee and talking about your experience and having them laugh in all the right places and know exactly what you're talking about. We could compare notes about transition and things like that. And you can't do that with people who are cisgender. You can tell them your story, but that's not the same thing as commiseration over sharing an identity. And so that was the bare beginnings of trans community. LGBT is what the acronym was for a long time. And even though it's a really different form of identity, we have common enemies. The people who are opposed to lesbian and gay civil rights are the same people that sponsor anti-trans bathroom bills and things like that. So there's reason for forming community under that umbrella, LGBT. So it was LGBT for a long time. Okay, where did this come from? Queer was a word that began to be reclaimed in 1985 by an organization called ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And they were reclaiming this word as an in-your-face kind of turning it back on people. This was a group of people that were trying to get the attention of the press and trying to get media attention because Ronald Reagan was completely ignoring the AIDS epidemic. Their friends were dying right and left, and they were fed up. So for them, queer was a political statement. But all of a sudden now, it's an identity. Starting about the mid-2000s, it's an identity. And it's not so much reclaimed as rebranded, because now that word used to be hurled at people to intimidate them and demean them, effing queer, that sort of thing. But now it's rebranded. It's an identity. And it's very hard to use that as a slur against somebody when it's their actual identity. And what it means to them is very fluid. It says nothing about who they're attracted to. It says nothing about their gender identity. It's a free to be kind of word. And it allows a lot of people with different attractions, different levels of gender identity to band together under the same identity label. And that's part of its attraction. Questioning? Well, yeah, LGBTQQIAAPNb. It would be pretty unusual for an adolescent to not go through some period of questioning, well, where do I fit? What exactly fits me? And these days, especially in cities like Portland, if a high schooler tells their friends, well, I'm questioning, their friends are very likely to say something like, well, cool, let us know if your pronouns change. And it's considered really a good thing, which is great, because if you think about it, we should all really have done that level of questioning of who we are very early in our lives, because who's anyone else to tell us who we are? That's on us to figure it out. So this newer generation is taking that seriously. Intersex is an interesting addition to the acronym because it's not really an identity. It's a group of medical conditions, about 35, I believe. I'm not a doctor, so don't hold me to that. But it basically is saying, okay, a baby's born, and we think in this culture you can say it's a boy or it's a girl with confidence that you're right. But in some cases, the baby's born and the genitalia is indeterminate. And that's what's an intersex condition. Now, some of these conditions are not visible. I have a friend who is a lesbian and has always identified as cisgender, never trans in any way, and found out in her mid-30s when she tried to get pregnant through artificial insemination, she found out she couldn't get pregnant because she had an undescended testicle. She was intersex and had never known. Her parents had never known either. So that's the sort of thing that's an intersex identity. You might wonder, well, why is it part of this acronym? Well, another friend of mine is a straight woman. She dates men. She's cisgender. She also has something like an undescended testicle. I don't remember exactly what her condition is, but it's not visible on the outside. But she told me that when she dates a guy, if she knows by the end of the first date that she wants to go further, she wants a second date, she thinks this might actually go somewhere, she has to tell him. And she said the reason she does is because she usually gets one of two reactions. One is the guy will say, an undescended testicle, well, that must mean there's something male about you, and that must mean that this is kind of gay, and I'm not gay, so I don't want to date you. The other reaction she gets is an undescended testicle. Well, that means that you're not quite a woman, you're not quite a man, you're trans in some way. I don't date trans people, I don't want to date you. So there's enough intersection of experience to warrant adding this letter onto the acronym. Now, the first A stands for ally. And when I say this, people often think of PFLAG, parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays, the people who are straight and cisgender supporting all the rest of us. But realistically, lesbians don't know what it means automatically to be trans. Gay men don't understand why somebody would call themselves queer. There really needs to be a lot more expansion of what ally means to span across the acronym so that we can understand each other better and be better allies to each other. The other A stands for asexual, and I was really struck by something in the reading, talking about romantic love and how Freudian terminology really kind of skewed people into thinking that sex had to be a certain way and you shouldn't talk about it and that sort of thing. Asexual is an example of bringing it to the surface for discussion and owning exactly how you feel as being okay. Now, there's a lot of misassumption about asexual, that people who are asexual, if they don't want to have sex, if that's not really their focus, there must be something wrong with them. Maybe they were sexually abused as children or something like that. But really what they're saying is, okay, I might fall in love with someone, but I really don't want to have sex all that often, and that's okay. Or they're saying, I love different people, I love them deeply, and I really don't want to have sex with people. I love to cuddle. They're saying things like that, and they're owning it as being fine. And that's the piece that I find really heartening, is they are doing the self-examination, and they're not buying into the Hollywood model of romance that we've been sold a bill of goods. We've been told you get married, you live happily ever after, you marry someone, you have sex every day, it's always fabulous and wonderful, and it never ends. How realistic is that? Not at all. So these are folks who are examining themselves and saying, this is exactly what I want and who I am. And I find that heartening. Pansexual is an expansion on bisexual. Bisexual, if you think about the definition, you can fall in love with, form relationships with men or women. Pansexual is saying, well, you don't have to be a man or a woman. You could be somewhere in between. You could be a trans person. It doesn't matter to me what your body configuration is or what your identity is. What matters to me is who you are as a person. I fall in love with people, as opposed to saying I fall in love with men or women. And it frees people up to just date whoever they find attractive. Now, the same criticism was made of pansexual people as bisexual people. Well, they must be promiscuous. But really, it doesn't mean they're promiscuous. What it means is their dating pool is really big. They're just as picky as anyone else about who they'll date. Now, the last letter for now is non-binary, and this confuses a lot of people. We live in such a binary culture. We think you can say it's a boy or it's a girl. Well, who says that there are only two categories of identity? Where did that come from? When you start asking questions like that, it becomes more clear that gender is a system. It's a social system. And different cultures have different numbers of identities available, different categories, different ways of determining things, which makes it pretty clear that it's a social system. It's not innately human to be one thing or another. The problem for non-binary people is that English hasn't caught up. The very term non-binary is problematic. It says what a person isn't, because there isn't language for what the person is. And so they're stuck using they, them. You might have heard he, they, or she, they. Those are people who are saying, well, he is a smaller box than I want to live in. I want to expand that a little bit, but I know I'm not trans and I'm not really non-binary. I'm happy being male. I've heard a number of men in the chorus, in the gay men's chorus, say things like that. They've started examining their own gender in their 50s and 60s. It's a really interesting process to watch. And then they'll come and tell me, which I find, I'm flattered by that. So non-binary is also very fluid. And that's something that you'll notice about these later additions to the acronym: queer, pansexual, non-binary. They don't really say that much about the person. So every person gets to define it for themselves, but they also have to. This is part of the soul searching. If you adopt a label that doesn't have a very specific definition to it, you kind of have to come up with your own definition and your own way of looking at it. And I find that really heartening too. So that's it for now. For now. Who knows what it'll be next year. Now, sometimes people ask, where did all this come from? That expansion. I'm going to go back to this, if I can go back to this previous slide a moment. If you look at LGBT, it was that for a long time, like 30 years or more. Then all of a sudden, in the last 15 years or so, we have all these new letters added on. What is that about? Well, I think this is who we have to thank. I grew up in the 1960s. That was the brand of feminism I was exposed to. And the messages of that brand of feminism were: respect yourself, take yourself seriously, don't let other people define you, don't let other people tell you who you are. Now we've got this younger generation. These are their grandmothers. 2 generations down the line, we have these youth affected by that message in that way. And I find that really ironic, because a lot of my friends are 1960s and 70s lesbian feminists, and they look at me and they say, what is all this about? They don't see that it's their legacy playing out. But I find it really heartening, because it's a generation really taking themselves and each other seriously. And I really just think that's great. Now, Two-Spirit, if you have any familiarity with the acronym, sometimes you'll see Two-Spirit added on. And I'm not comfortable doing that, because this is a concept that comes out of indigenous culture from this continent. And as a white person, to me, if I put that in the acronym, it feels like cultural appropriation. LGBT plus is certainly not from indigenous culture. Now, you will see it in the acronym, though, sometimes. There are some indigenous people who will add it on, because to them, it's their version of lesbian, gay, trans. Now, I saw a client once who was of Cherokee descent, and he was a trans man, and he was really curious, what did original Cherokee culture say about trans identity? So he did some research. And what he discovered is that in the ancient Cherokee culture, when a baby was born, they knew they didn't know who the child was. They did not say it's a boy or it's a girl. Now, I'm extrapolating from what my client told me. I have a feeling they had pronouns like they, them that were used specifically for babies, because they already knew they didn't know. So as the child would get older, at certain ages, they would present them with certain games, certain toys, certain implements, and by the child's behavior, they knew who they were. And at that point, they were on a path in life. And I thought, well, how civilized is that? The other piece of that is that, like in this culture, the people we assign boy, we expect them to behave in a certain way. The people we call girl, we expect them to behave in a certain way, and many do. In the Cherokee culture, if you had a baby that we would call a boy that went this way instead of going over here with the other boys, that would draw the attention of the elders of the tribe, and they would pay attention to that child because that was one pathway toward becoming a shaman. And that's what the word two-spirit means. You have two. You're not just one thing going this direction. And the family that had a two-spirit child was honored. It was considered an honor. How different is that from the interpretation our culture puts on trans or non-binary identity? It's like night and day. Intersectionality is something that we could all stand to apply because the original lesbian and gay community was very white, and it was very white-centered. I knew a number of Black lesbians who tried to participate in lesbian community, and many of them gave up in frustration because what they found is that the issues they were facing as Black women were not even on the table for discussion. But they weren't just lesbians, they were Black lesbians. They had both forms of discrimination going on at the same time. And the only form of discrimination being taken seriously in those communities in that day were for being gay or lesbian. Nothing about your race, your nationality, your religion, or anything like that. So looking at people as a whole, not just one form of identity, is really helpful when you want to find out what's the best way to be an ally to them. So we really need to redefine ally today because there is so much pushback now. I never thought I would see a return to the way things were in the 60s or 70s in terms of discrimination against gay men and lesbians. And now trans people are on the radar. There's all these anti-trans bathroom bills and things of that sort. There's this push to ban certain books in schools. I never thought I would see a return to this, but allies are more important today than ever before. So I did bring a couple of copies of my book here today, each of my books. So if anyone's interested, they're over on the piano. And those of you who are on Zoom, you're welcome to go to my website. There are descriptions of my books on my website. So that's it for right now. I would love to field questions at this point. I'm going to sit down here. I had knee replacement about 6 months ago, and standing for a huge length of time is not the best idea.
That was so informative.
Well, good. I'm glad.
It was also humbling. It makes sense. It made such sense. I'm a little overwhelmed.
I'm sure that would be, it would be I don't know what the word is. It wouldn't be normal to be not overwhelmed. It's a lot of it's a lot of information. It's a lot of different identities. It's a lot to sort through.
You are absolutely right. In saying that no one would know I was trans. Joyce, come on in. You've got a question.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but like Helen, I'm still sort of accept or taking in all this information. But one question that came up early when you talked about intersex, I wonder what has happened to the term hermaphrodite. That's the term that comes to my mind when you talked about the child born with indistinguishable genitals. So I'll just stop with that one because I'm sure I'll have other questions.
Well, that's a really good point. When I was coming of age as a trans person, excuse me, the word transsexual was still in vogue. Transgender, the term female to male, F to M and M to F, those were community created terms, gradually supplanted transsexual because it was very medical model. And it was perceived as something that had been put on us by other people. And we thought, no, we need our own terminology. So we invented our own. Hermaphrodite is a similar thing. It's an older term, and you won't find people using it these days. Now, intersex is, excuse me, intersex is a medical term, but that's because this is a medical condition. Whereas being trans, no one knows where the seat of identity is in the human psyche. Why are some people gay and some people are not? No one knows where that is, but it's certainly not in the genitals. So assigning gender at birth based on looking at someone's genitals, it doesn't work. If that was really accurate, no one would ever need to transition.
Right.
So in terms of intersex, it's a word that's replaced hermaphrodite. Now, why that happened exactly, I'm not entirely sure. my guess is, this is just a guess based on a lot of experience of different communities, that the word hermaphrodite had baggage attached to it. It was not a positive thing. It was some weirdness. So if you replace it with a medical term, maybe you can get people to see this as a medical condition and not some weird thing where you should avoid the person.
That's interesting. I never thought of it as negative. I know you have other questions, but I just wanted to say briefly that my niece has two daughters, and when the younger one, I think she was maybe 13, 14, 15, right in there, started questioning her sexuality. And I thought, well, that's perfectly normal. But my niece took her to therapy. She just couldn't get over it. She had, oh, this is terrible. I have to get her straightened out. And I haven't had a conversation with her to find out exactly where that went. But it worried me at the time. Leave the girl alone. Let her develop. You know?
Yeah. Conversion therapy is every single association associated with the therapy profession, all the different licensing boards and whatnot, every one of them has come out condemning conversion therapy. And the reason they do doesn't have anything to do with religion or philosophy. It has to do with understanding that identity is innate. People are born the way they're born. And the role of the therapist is to help someone accept themselves. So if you give someone hope of changing something that's innate, you're setting them on a path of potential suicidality. Mm-hmm. And as you can, it just makes perfect sense that the licensing boards, all the different associations would say, that's just wrong. You cannot take that stance and hold your license. Right. And so now the only place you find conversion therapy is within a religious setting. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to put a caveat out here. Back in the 60s, I know some older lesbians who did undergo, they didn't call it conversion therapy back then. They were in psychoanalysis because they really did believe, because people did believe back then that everyone was born straight and born cisgender. And if you later said you were something else, it was because something nasty happened to you in childhood mm-hmm. that set you on the wrong path. And therefore, if you can go back and address that, then you can get on the right path and you'll be straight and cisgender. But that had nothing to do with religion. And I really want to emphasize that because this whole tying it into religion is a fairly new concept. Back in the 60s, that's not the way it was viewed.
We've got a question from Friendly House. I believe Dave Gray is first. Come on in, Dave Gray.
I am 85 years old. And of course, when I was young, in the 40s and the 50s, there were only three ways of identifying gender: male, female, or queer. And queer is definitely not a positive term. It's just been homosexual. That's just a comment. Now, my question, and I'm kind of struggling how to ask this question, is trans people. If you're a trans guy, I'm wondering if you have the persistent, even annoying sexual drive that men like me, I must admit, it's almost like, your sexual identity. It's like you have a pet dog that is tail wagging, is always coming up and wanting attention. And so, but I have a hard time imagining if a trans guy would have that innate biological drive, unless for some, and I don't know anything about this, there are some physical adjustments, surgeries that are made. So can you talk about that a little?
Absolutely. And in regard to your first comment, back in the day, there was no distinction made between sexual orientation and gender identity. Back in the 60s, it was this kind of this confused muddle. So yes, it was man, woman, queer, but when you think about it in those terms, it makes perfect sense to separate the two identities, but back then they weren't. And so trans women, for example, were viewed as gay men who went one step further, drag queens who went one step further. So there was a tying of the two communities together that was really inaccurate. And in terms of the transition process itself, I didn't always have a beard and I wasn't always a baritone. That's testosterone. And that's exactly what it does to a trans man. Trans women have a harder row to hoe because testosterone has already given them a beard and a deep voice. And The beard you can deal with sort of by electrolysis. It's painful. It takes a long time. The deep voice, you need vocal coaching and things of that sort, because there's not much you can do about that. There are surgeries of shaving the vocal folds, but I don't know many trans women who have undertaken that step. It's very delicate surgery. So the hormones go a long way toward transitioning people. Now, in terms of trans men and sex drive, as a therapist, I heard two different stories. Trans men would come into my office saying, and trans man is the one who transitions to male. They would come in my office early on testosterone. They're 14-year-old boys again. That's what it's done. It's taken them right back to the beginning of puberty with the inception of hormones, a new hormone balance. But they're not 14 in middle school anymore. They're probably holding down a job, or they're in college. They're not. Well, and the ones who transition young, this is one reason to do it, is so that they go through that puberty at the right time of life. If you're 40 years old holding a job and you're acting like a 14-year-old boy, that doesn't fit. So a lot of my trans men clients would come in my office and they would say things like, how do guys get anything done? I'm horny all the time. I can't concentrate on anything. Well, if you think back to if you were raised as a guy, if you're cisgender, what was it like when you were 13 or 14? That is exactly what it was like, right? Well, for the trans women, they're blocking testosterone and taking estrogen. 40 years old, holding down a job, feeling like a 14-year-old girl. And they're coming in my office saying, oh my God, when something stressful happens at work, I feel like crying all the time. How do women handle this? So one of two reactions. The hormones are hugely powerful in the way we experience the world. And when you change that hormone balance and you switch that balance to a different one, it changes everything. It changes your relationship to yourself and everyone around you. It's one of the things that people don't focus on that much, because they focus on the visible aspects, and they focus on things like, oh my God, now I have to call my son my daughter, or something like that. But the hormones are this internal change that starts very quickly. From the first dose, you can really feel a difference, but no one else can see anything different about you. It's quite a challenging thing to go through. And that's another reason why it really helps for trans people to connect with each other, especially early in this process. They can really support each other through this change because it's dramatic. So other questions or comments?
Yes, we've got another question from Friendly House. Wayne, come on in from Friendly House.
Yeah, my question is, it seems like when you start using so many acronyms that it starts getting watered down to where people don't understand it and then just ignore it after a while because they don't understand. And if you use too many, it just seems like it loses its quality of identity, because it just overwhelms the majority of people. And when it was just LGBT, people seem to understand what you were talking about. And now, I don't understand it, and I'm around some. And it really seems like we've overdone it. And I don't mean that negative. It just means in the general population, it just seems like there's too much.
That's a really good point. And it does among a lot of lesbians and gay men and trans people, especially the older generation, the ones that came of age when it was LGBT. That's one of the problems with that plus sign. It's not just that there's a lot of letters after it, it's that the letters after it get ignored for the most part. But when I think about the younger generation with the labels they're adopting, they are so fluid that maybe over time we're going to have fewer labels than we've had before. Maybe everybody's going to identify as queer or something along those lines. Because I agree with you, it really is becoming, it's difficult to parse it all out. It's difficult to keep it all together as one community, because it isn't. It's a whole bunch of different communities. I've newer phrases. I heard gender and sexual alliance, I think it was, which is different from the GSA in high school. They're basically saying, okay, we're minorities based on gender and or sexuality. Let's just call it that, gender and sexual minority. That's a much shorter acronym. Now, whether people will still feel the need to bond with, like, will asexual people still feel the need to have some form of asexual community so they can have a roundtable conversation with each other? Because I guarantee you there's a lot of gay men and lesbians that look askance at the whole idea of asexuality. So can they really understand each other? But that's part of the point of conversations like this. is for people to talk to each other and take each other seriously. That's the other piece of it. Don't diminish each other's experience. Don't question somebody else's experience of their own identity. It's their experience, not yours. So that's the real point of that. But yeah, the acronym's gotten extremely long. And like I said, it may get longer yet before it gets shorter.
We have a question from the Zoom audience. What percentage of male and female population are cis? This is from Vale and Kathy Humble. Are cisgendered?
That's a really good question, and we don't have a good answer to that. And one reason is because it's only recently that trans identity's been kind of on the radar to even count. Because like I said earlier, it's the transition process that's marginalizing. And when people feel invisible again, when they feel like they can blend in, maybe they get a new job, they move to a new part of town, and it sinks in, oh, nobody here knows that I used to be so-and-so. So maybe I don't even really want to tell people for a while. But if no one really knows, how do you get counted? And if you can't really accurately get counted, how can you say, well, this number of people are cisgender, because you don't know exactly how many people have transitioned? And that's especially true of older generations. Transition as a physical process has been available since the late 1940s. That's when the first transitions happened. I was fortunate enough to, in 2007, a trans man called me and asked me for a referral for a doctor to renew his hormone prescription. And I said, okay, where do you live? Well, he lived outside Corvallis. And then he said, I probably have to come to Portland for this because I want a doctor that won't put in my chart why I need the hormones. And that was an unusual request. So I got to talking with him, and it turned out he started taking hormones the year I was born. I'm 67 years old, 1955. So I interviewed him and I got his story. And it turned out that I was the second trans person he'd ever met face-to-face that he knew of. He didn't think the first one counted because they never talked about it. Because at that time you transitioned, you never looked back, you never told anyone if you didn't absolutely have to, which means you're romantic partners, and you just basically lived your life. And that's what he had done. So I felt very fortunate to get his story at all. And I felt fortunate that he got to meet me and my wife, Christina, because he'd never met other people who just talked about all this like it was normal. He had never had the experience of coming out to a cisgender person and experiencing support because he never told anyone.
Wow.
And that's what transition was in the 1950s,
Just
on into the 60s. So how can you count the numbers of people when they don't want to be counted?
right.
This current generation would like to be counted. So I think we may end up with more accurate statistics at some point. But it's been difficult in the past to count numbers of people. Yeah, I honor him. I tell his story every chance I get. He died in 2017. He was in his early 80s, and he was a miserable old man, very isolated.
Isolated, because it sounds very similar to people, fair-skinned people of African American ancestry that transitioned into the white community and had to reject their black family, had to hide from their black family. Okay, Mike from Friendly House has a question. Come on in, Mike.
Okay, over the years, comedians have often made fun of gay people and their routines and everything. One thing to point out, Graham Chapman, who was a member of Monty Python, was a very openly gay man. He came out to his fellow performers in the mid 60s, and they accepted him. And Marty Feldman, who was one of his co-stars in At Last 1948 show, said, we're not about to stop making poof jokes. And Graham said, no, keep going. Now, nowadays, a lot of the backlash against the gay community, one of the things they would complain about is, recently George Takei, who played Sulu on Star Trek, who's also openly gay, he had a celebrity roast recently, and one of the people who was there was the late Gilbert Gottfried, who came on and just did all these really juvenile jokes, and George Takei was just laughing his ass off. So where do you stand, or I don't know how to ask this, but Where do you see where you can at least take a joke? Or, is there a difference between a joke that just, makes fun of mannerisms, whereas as opposed to something that's really demeaning?
Yeah, that's the line to draw right there. What's the intention of the joke? What is it that people are laughing at? And recently I've seen, and I wish I could think of an example, but I can't, on Facebook, I've seen some memes that were jokes about trans identity. And to my mind, the way that I looked at that was, and notice I said that the way I looked at that, because you may hear other people say something completely different. I thought, that you're becoming part of the culture when you start to see jokes about your identity, or jokes that are based in your identity, I should say, because nothing about them was demeaning, but they were trans jokes, and they were in mainstream venues. And I thought, well, this is really cool. So I really enjoyed that. Now, demeaning, that would be a different thing, but these weren't. And like I said, I wish I could think of an example, but they weren't demeaning. I laughed. I wasn't offended. Now, the trick there is, if George Takei had been offended and gone to the comedian and said, that really wasn't, or that particular joke, what would the comedian's response be? That's the main thing. Would the comedian say, oh, I never looked at it that way, I'll take that joke out of the routine? So that would be the key, is the response. If you get pushback, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the whole idea that my identity is now suddenly fodder for comedy, because there's a lot of funny things that happen to trans people. I could tell you a lot of funny stories.
Okay, one more observation. Well, the late David Rappaport, who was a dwarf actor,
Yeah.
he made a guest appearance on LA Law and defending a guy who did dwarf tossing at a bar. He told the jury, don't you for a minute feel sorry for us. Believe me, we will take your ridicule over your pity any day.
Mike, let's see, we got a question from Mel Christians.
Yes, your talk kind of made me think that that maybe a Kinsey report had it right, where there's just a continuum of behaviors. There aren't really any slots for anybody to fit into. That everybody's got their own sexuality. That we're a country with 300 million different sexualities, and I wonder if you agree with that. But the problem here comes with language. Then you're trying to give us a handbook to the current terminology, but there are other things that are kind of humorous, like if I try to match my paint and go to the paint store, it matters whether I'm going to a Sherwin-Williams or a Miller paint store, what kind of color is going to match my wall. And it's pretty funny, all the different names they have for colors, all the different names they have for drinks at Starbucks, all the different names for wines and cheeses and stuff. Those things are all funny, but you hesitate to want to be funny about things that people take so darn seriously. Do you think we'll ever make any progress on this language thing? Because it seems like maybe language is our enemy or something. I don't know how we'll ever solve that.
Well, I think we are making progress when I look at the vagueness and lack of definition of the currently available identity labels. Like queer, for example, it's so fluid. So many people could adopt that and make it fit them and just define it as it suits them. Because you're right, it's all very individual, very individual. I met a gay man once at a Pride festival, and he said that if he was 30 years younger, he would happily be calling himself gay because he's really only attracted to men. But he said, that's a smaller box than I want to live in, so I identify as queer. And he made the point, what if I got interested in a trans man who hadn't had any lower surgery? If I still identified as gay, that might set up a cognitive dissonance in me because of the very narrow definition of what it means to be a gay man. So when I look at the more fluid identities available today, I think we're on that right track. And it is difficult, though, when you look at pronouns and language, because as a writer, I look at that and I think, well, it's a chicken and egg situation, because how does the culture advance if you don't have the language that people can really allow it to expand their minds by having different, newer forms of pronouns? For example, we've only got he and she. So the language, but then if the language, how does the language develop if the culture isn't changing?
Mhm.
So it's a chicken and egg proposition. And this current generation using terms like non-binary, I think future generations are going to admire their fortitude, because they are constantly, now that's an identity where they have to come out lifelong if they want to live in authenticity, because they will be correcting people on their pronouns for the rest of their lives. It's not going to be an automatic that somebody says, oh, do you go by they pronouns? Not really.
Since you get to choose your own pronouns, then nobody knows what fits unless they know you and know your pronouns, and that kind of changes the purpose of pronouns in the whole language. It's a tough nut to crack.
It is a game changer. I mean, really, if you think about it, there's all kinds of questions you could ask that to contemplate, like, why do we put gender on a birth certificate?
Yeah.
Even assuming that we could know what a baby's gender is at birth, why is gender on the birth certificate at all? We're making a statement about core identity. We don't put sexual orientation on the birth certificate, just gender. But why? And when you start asking questions like that, it really raises up questions about our culture. Like, why are we the way we are about gender? We are so determined to assign gender.
Mhm.
I don't think you can count the number of times in a day you use pronouns. And every time we use a pronoun, we're gendering somebody. We're assigning a core identity to them without putting any thought into it whatsoever.
Yeah. Now, you talked about being raised in the 60s. In the 50s, gender only applied to language. It didn't apply to people at all. That gender was a language construct and not anything about reality.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think on into the 60s as well. And that's why nobody was upset by the use of terms like mankind. It applies to everybody. It was feminists that started questioning that in the 60s, saying, no, sorry, every time you use mankind, women are left out.
Right.
So again, it goes back to that 1960s feminism of putting all this on the table for question.
So growing up in Brooklyn, on the outskirts of Brooklyn, there were a lot of lots, open fields, and we had a field where we were growing beans. We got beans from our mother. Anyway, long story short, there was sort of squatter homes there, and in one of the squatter homes, a young lady lived with her father, and she insisted that that plot of land was hers. Now, I was the captain of the team. I was the forward guy. She didn't want to deal with us, and none of the guys in my group wanted to. So I had to wrestle her. And if I wrestled her to the ground and held her down, she gave up. So what I'm leading up to in all your acronyms is tomboy. She was classified as a tomboy. Why would any girl wrestle with a boy? Okay, that's my comment. My question is, if you watched 60 Minutes last week, Anderson Cooper was interviewing the head of the New South Baptist Conference, more than 70 million people. And he's very liberal, and he said he would never vote for, I'm not going to go into names. But when he got to the gender thing, he said, God created man and woman, and there is no room for anything. And I could see Anderson, who is a gay man, saying, and then he approached the same question again, and he was getting really mad, and he had no accommodation whatsoever. So where does organized religion do what it does in separating the thinking of people who accept everything as dogma, as law, as, is coming from on high, and therefore, why should I accommodate anybody? You're either a girl or a boy, especially if you're a boy who's circumcised as Jewish men are, and I am circumcised. So I can never become a girl because, my God. But anyway, the question is, where does form of religion have its greatest impact and its greatest damage?
Well, the greatest damage comes, and this is speaking as a therapist here, I had a number of clients who were transitioning, and they had to extricate themselves from their families first, because their families were not going to ever accept them. And it was very sad, but luckily they're all family to each other. And what I found is that generally a few family members would come along for the ride because they were all family to each other and they didn't want to lose that. And so those clients felt supported by a few people in their family, but had to let the rest go. And really, when you think about it, if the Bible was literally quite true, God created man and woman, where do intersex people fall? What does that mean when someone's intersex and born that way? What's the meaning of all this? I'm Episcopal myself. I'm on the vestry of my Episcopal church. I missed church service to do this morning, by the way. But anyway, not all religions believe that. It's only very certain specific religions, fundamentalist religions, that are extremely rigid and just don't have any room for personal growth, any room for change. Fortunately, that's not all religions. But I did feel for the clients that were transitioning out of those religions because they had such a hard time, because their levels of self-acceptance were so low because they've been raised with this belief. And generally, I heard one or two stories from my clients. One story was, I've always known who I was. I saw one client who was 53 years old, and she said, I've known I was a girl since before I could talk. Then she said, that's the first time I've ever said that out loud.
Wow.
Well, that's the background she came from. She knew really early on, don't ever tell anyone. Not only will she get in trouble, but what could she do about it? So it took her till 53 years old to finally do something about it. Another person was the pallbearer at her father's funeral and had this epiphany realization, if I don't do something about this, I'm going to die a man. So I heard stories like that a lot. The people who were much better off were the ones with parents who would look at their children and say, okay, now who are you and how do I help you be the best you that you can be? That is a PFLAG parent attitude. And the children with parents like that, I had one mom who called me because her 4-year-old had crawled in her lap and said, Mommy, I know you think I'm a tomboy, but I'm really a boy. Well, the only reason the child felt like he could say that to mom is because he knew mom wouldn't punish him. Mom called me to find out what's our move here as parents to support our child. What's the thing we should be doing?
Yeah, thank you. And as grandparents, we're learning that same lesson in our family.
Yeah.
The exact same lesson.
Yes.
Thank you. You were so informative. I really applaud you. Thank you for so much for being
Oh, well,
here.
thank you. Thank you.
We've got a question from the front row of Friendly House. Come on in.
We kind of talked about pansexuality. There's a couple words that we didn't talk about in this whole thing. And so it's not so much a question as this, could you maybe touch on demisexual and sapiosexual and how, like, you talked about gender identity and sexual identity and how all of this either doesn't fit under the pan letter or how it does, and like maybe what we're going to be having going forward with like the differences in these things of pan, demi, and sapio. Thank you.
Well, and I'm not even clear myself on all the definitions because things change so much. That's a really good example right there. And the terminology of asexual as well. There's gray ace. There's all kinds of different terms that people have invented, because they're trying to find a way to describe to other people who they are. So I don't even know. I don't have an answer to that. It's another example of how the terminology is consistently evolving, continually evolving. And that's the only thing you can say about it, is it won't be the same next week as it is today. But that's another thing about terms like asexual and pansexual, is that everybody is free to figure out exactly what it means to them, which means they will come up with their own language. And those are good examples of it. And what do they mean? Do you know?
I might be a little bit off on them. So sapio, if I'm not mistaken, is attraction to intellect, whereas demi, I believe, is I forget. See, that demi is the one where maybe I struggle. So there's pan, where it's kind of you are attracted to people when you're attracted to people, how you're attracted to them, which is where I kind of was like, so there's some sub areas there when we look at demi and sapio, where sapio is kind of similar to that, but sapio is about being attracted to intellect itself, that like they would see a person like Einstein and they would be like, this is a great mind, and they are attracted through that. And then demi is I'm not sure, like I should actually, like I wish I knew like a more literal definition of it, but that's where like there's a lot of spectrum there, but also there's some differences.
Well, I'm going to look it up because these are actually not part of pansexual, but part of asexual.
Yeah, and so this is
Yeah.
where like there's a lot of language there, and part of one of the things that I asked was like, how do we move forward with this? Where even with the asexual area there, that in some sense these don't even fit there. And so especially with demi and sapio, like this is where they might be sexual but not define themselves as asexual people, right? And so this is where, again, talking even about how when you mentioned like there's gender identity and sexual orientation, where again, these kind of cradle that intersection there when we look at pan, demi, and sapiosexual. And so that's kind of where I'm like, how do we move forward? Like, what are we going to do as a community to be able to represent these people, but also to hopefully find succinct ways of explaining really, really complex things, where when we look at all those, like you said, how do we even define the difference between pan, demi, and sapio? Because they are different, but they're not.
Right.
Yeah. I'm gonna interrupt. So go ahead and answer the question. Yeah.
Well, you also know that you've made it into the culture when you're in Wikipedia. Demisexual, a sexual orientation in which an individual does not experience primary sexual attraction. Attraction is based on immediately observable characteristics such as appearance or smell, and is experienced immediately after a first encounter.
Okay. We've got a definition.
I'm not sure that made it totally clear to me.
Exactly.
It's a really good example, though, of evolution of identity and terminology and how things change and are moving on. So yes, next question.
There's a comment in chat that I hope everyone from Jacob Kilpack, and I hope everyone will take a moment to read that. Gretchen, do you have a question?
I do. Actually, the questions have been stacking up.
Yes.
First off, I'm very interested in the effect of hormones. And what I would be very interested in is if someone who started out with one set of hormones and then was medically given a sequence that would transition them to something else, and a first-person account of what this experience was like as far as their perhaps change of attitudes or interests, or because this is a thing I'm curious about, moving in both directions. And secondly, I wonder if there were people, if you've encountered people who just want hormones that will obliterate their sexual desire. Maybe they have an interest in pursuing something that they just don't want to be distracted by this, this thing, and they just want to get down to the other business of life. And it's interesting because Teutonic and Romance languages, they put gender on inanimate objects. English, fortunately, for whatever reason, we missed it. We still got it for people. And in Japanese, there is no gender. I mean, Kawasaki-san could be male, female, or what have you. And is there any possibility that maybe the simplifying of the language in English would simply to move in the Japanese direction and have no gender identifiers at all? So those are my questions.
Yeah, the same thing holds true with Chinese, because we have several friends where Chinese is their first language, and they have difficulty with pronouns because it's not part of their culture to do that. In terms of the hormone thing, that's one of the gifts of transitioning, especially transitioning the direction I did, is that we have control over our hormone balance. And I have one friend who was so distracted by the testosterone, he cut his level in half. He said, I'm working on my doctorate. I need to be able to write my dissertation. I don't need the distraction of this hormone. And so that was a real gift to him to be able to say, okay, I'm going to have a half dose of hormones. And he did. Now, many people have written their autobiographies and memoirs and things like that, and they have a lot to say about hormones. We don't want to think that we're all a bunch of chemical reactions, but there's a lot of hormonal basis in truth about the stereotypes about men and women, like men only ever thinking about sex. There's a lot of basis in truth in that. And women being more emotional than men. There's basis in truth in that. That's why those trans women were having the problems at work that they were. One trans woman was a project manager and kept her job through transition. And she told me that the first time that some stressful thing happened at work after she started taking estrogen, she felt this upwelling of emotion in the pit of her stomach that she had never experienced before. And it took her completely by surprise. And she excused herself really quick and she went in the bathroom and she closed the door and she burst into tears. And she was looking in the mirror and she thought, how can I get my job done if this is going to happen every time something stressful happens? And I had to tell her, well, you know, this is what 13 and 14-year-olds learn how to navigate in middle school. That's exactly what you do. And the adults around you expect this kind of reaction from you. You're a screaming Mimi because of estrogen. And it's something that we don't like to talk about or admit any truth to, but anyone who has ever transitioned with hormones has very similar stories to tell. It's just amazing what a difference it makes in your brain and your psyche and your emotional reactions. Everything, our whole perception of the world is filtered through that hormone balance.
Can you please write somewhere, perhaps in the chat, books or whatever, where we could read about this? Because I feel that as a happy female, very nicely integrated, that I have a lot of times no sense of what's happening with men. And that's why I'm very curious, why they have trouble understanding me.
And that brings up an interesting point. That Cherokee client that I referenced earlier, in that whole culture that honors two-spirit people, I think that our culture is really missing an opportunity, because I think that people who end up transitioning and changing that hormone balance, we're intended to be the bridge. I lived 42 years female, and now I've lived 25 years male. That's a lot of experience that all of you can draw on, which is why I'm here today. But the people that transitioned at the same time I did, these guys that I met way back in the day, we were all starting about the same time. I think of them as my litter mates. And they're not sitting here. They're off living their lives. I've lost touch with most of them, and they don't want to be sitting here. That's the thing. I'm sitting here so they don't have to. But somebody had better sit here and talk about all this sort of stuff, because we are the bridge. I'm the one that can talk about what it's like to have an estrogen-based response to something, and people can believe me and take me seriously and not feel like I'm making a caricature or a parody on women. Because I'm not. I'm speaking from personal experience all along the way. And that's a huge gift to the culture, that the culture has denigrated and turned its back on. And so now we've got this gender divide between men and women. And, a lot of people say the same kind of thing. I wish I understood those people over there better. Well, you could. But as for books, not to be too shameless about it, but I've written 2 of them myself. And I do have references on my website also about other books that people have written that are really invaluable. So yeah, there is stuff out there that can help you along that path. And the people that I have found who understood a bit about what it's like to need to transition were cisgender women who at some point in their lives had something go awry with their hormone balance, or they had a difficulty with pregnancy and their hormone balance was askew, and they had anxiety or depression or something along those lines. That's what it's like when your hormones are not in sync and not in balance for you. So it's a little inkling of what it's like to need to transition, because really the way that I view the need to transition with hormones is that the brain is expecting one hormone and it's getting a different one. I had one client, after she started taking hormones, a few weeks later, she said, now I know what normal feels like.
Ooh.
And that's exactly what she meant. It was the hormone balance. It had nothing to do with her family or her work or anything. It had only to do with the way the hormones were in her system and in her brain.
First of all, thank you. It was so enlightening, and to have the courage.
You're entirely welcome.
Yeah, that was, to sit in that chair takes a lot of courage, and the world thanks you. I thank you personally. Dave,